I will explain the process from the Russo-Japanese War to the Pacific War. In this issue, we will explain the Nomonhan incident. The Nomonhan incident was a military conflict that resulted from a border dispute between Manchukuo, the Soviet Union, and Mongolia. This was an important battle that changed Japan's subsequent war strategy. In the previous commentary, I explained the massive Soviet offensive and the Second Nomonhan incident. In this article, I will explain the events leading up to the ceasefire. In 1939, the Great Offensive in Jokog began on August 20, 1939, with an overwhelmingly superior force to the Japanese. The Japanese, who did not own tanks, were literally overrun by armored Soviet troops on the unobstructed steppe. However, instead of taking a defensive position in the face of this massive offensive, the Japanese military decided to go on the offensive. They planned to go behind the Soviets, who were trying to surround and annihilate the Japanese forces, and encircle them in the opposite direction. The frontline commanders and enlisted men were well aware of the recklessness of this operation. When one second lieutenant said to his superior, "If we carry out this operation, we will be wiped out," his superior replied, "I think so, too." On August 24th, the operation was carried out, but the planned units were unable to defend themselves against the onslaught of the Soviet forces, and less than half of the units were able to participate in the operation. The attack by the unit led by Major General Kobayashi began at 9 o'clock. It was an operation unthinkable in modern warfare, in which infantry alone were to assault a 5-kilometer prairie path to a highland defended by Soviet troops, including tanks. Naturally, the Japanese soldiers fell to the overwhelming firepower of the Soviet forces before they could reach their destination. Kometsubara and his 23rd Division headquarters also began to advance, but were immediately blocked by enemy air and tank units. With nothing to block the tank's way, Kometsubara was prepared to die in battle. Major General Kobayashi, Kometsubara's highly trusted general, was killed in the assault, and the unit was overrun by Soviet tanks and nearly wiped out. The company commander who made this report fled with 40 men, and Tsuji shouted at them. Tsuji said, "You guys abandoned your superiors and ran away. Are you still Japanese soldiers?" Tsuji returned to the scene with that company commander and others, and found Regimental Commander Sakai badly wounded. Sakai said, "As you can see, the situation is as bad as you can see. If you want me to attack again, I will. But I don't think any of us will make it out alive." Kometsubara had planned to launch an attack tomorrow morning, but Tsuji, who had seen the scene, believed the operation to be unfeasible and ordered a retreat on his own initiative. Tsuji, a general staff officer, did not have the authority to issue orders to the division, and it was an overstepping of his authority. The division commander, Kometsubara, was grateful for Tsuji's action, and he acquitted Tsuji of the offense. The seriously wounded regimental commander Sakai felt responsible for the withdrawal and committed suicide at the hospital where he was being held. Kometsubara continued the attack on the following day, the 25th, but all units suffered nearly 50% casualties, and the 23rd Division was almost completely destroyed. Thus, the Japanese offensive, which was said to be the poorest of all the battles in the Nomonhan incident, ended in disaster. The Soviet Army Stern described the Japanese offensive as the Japanese army went out of its way to come where we wanted them to come and lost on its own initiative. The Noro highlands were guarded by troops led by Haste. Haste had been defending the highlands to the death for nearly a month, having ceased to be a part of the Soviet offensive that began on July 20th. The Kajiwara battalion under Haste was defending the front line of the Noro highlands. They continued to repel the Soviets, although they were so cornered that Kajiwara, the battalion commander, had to use a machine gun and throw hand grenades in the Soviet assault. However, when they ran out of ammunition and food, Kajiwara advised Haste to charge in and annihilate them, but Haste ordered them to defend the high ground to the death. Kajiwara's men appealed to him to charge in and die together, but he admonished his men to die together in this position. The Japanese military's policy of dying rather than becoming prisoners of war reached every corner of the soldiers, and no one was likely to think of surrendering. Haste also intended to die with his position, but after more than a month of fighting with almost no men left to defend the position, he changed his mind and gave the order to retreat on his own initiative. Haste was an excellent commander who defended his position for almost a month despite the overwhelming odds. However, like Aoki, he was advised by Komatsubara to commit suicide after the war, and he did so on September 20th. The Soviet offensive had almost completely taken over the positions defended by the Japanese forces, leaving only the Balsagal highlands. This was defended by a battalion commanded by Colonel Yamagata. The Soviets launched an offensive here as well, and Yamagata's unit was just waiting to be annihilated. If the troops in Yamagata were wiped out, it meant that Komatsubara's 23rd Division was almost completely wiped out. Komatsubara, who felt that Japan's international reputation would be damaged if the 23rd Division was wiped out, gathered his remaining troops and attempted to rescue Yamagata's unit. However, Komatsubara had gathered only about 1,400 men, and with the Soviets encircling the plateau with tens of thousands of troops, he could hardly expect his rescue to be successful. The 6th Army advised Komatsubara to stop the relief, but Komatsubara ignored the advice and went to the rescue. Yamagata heard the news of Komatsubara's departure for relief, but no relief came. This was because Komatsubara's sortie was delayed. Yamagata gave up that relief would not come due to enemy interference. Yamagata ordered his men to retreat. During his retreat, he was surrounded by Soviet troops, and in a desperate attempt to escape, he burned his flag and committed suicide. Komatsubara replaced Yamagata and reached the Balsagar Plateau, where he again established a defensive position and defended the plateau. Komatsubara was prepared to die there, but when the 6th Army ordered him to retreat, he and 400 men charged the enemy position and returned through the encirclement. The 23rd Division at Komatsubara had a 78% loss ratio and was literally wiped out. In August alone, 8,500 men were killed or wounded. On the other hand, the Soviet forces that attacked by force also suffered 11,000 casualties, according to a recently released report. Russian studies have assessed that this report is also underreported, and it is believed that the actual damage was even greater. Now, while the Soviets and Japanese were fighting in Nomonhan, shocking news was brought to Japan. It was the conclusion of the German-Soviet non-aggression pact. Japan, which was allied with Germany, was completely unaware of this story. The army, which had allied itself with Germany, with the Soviets as a hypothetical enemy, was greatly shocked by this news. German Foreign Minister Lippentrop offered to mediate the Nomonhan incident with the Japanese ambassador. He also said that he was considering a four-party alliance involving Japan, Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union. Japan was considering a ceasefire with the Soviets at the end of July, before the Soviet general offensive, but believed that negotiations would be difficult without some kind of tactical victory. The Soviets also wanted a ceasefire, and they told the Japanese ambassador that the Soviets were willing to accept any offer from Japan. However, when the 23rd Division was driven to the brink of destruction by the massive Soviet offensive that began at the end of July, Japan could no longer hope to negotiate favorable terms, and peace negotiations stalled. Lippentrop offered Stalin to mediate the Nomonhan incident, as he had told the Japanese ambassador. The war situation favored the Soviets, and Stalin avoided an immediate answer. Despite the destruction of the 23rd Division, the Kwantung Army was still determined to continue fighting. They intended to deliver a crushing blow to the Soviets and then bring about peace. The General Staff in Tokyo did not know the details of the Nomonhan situation and agreed that a blow to the Soviets would bring about peace. The Kwantung Army intended to pour more troops into the area and fight another battle. The General Staff in Tokyo did not have an accurate grasp of the war situation based on reports from the Kwantung Army and learned through its own channels that the 23rd Division had been destroyed in Nomonhan. The General Staff decided that it would be difficult for the Kwantung Army to change the war situation and came up with the idea of making peace with the Soviets without fighting. The General Staff Office dispatched Nakajima, Deputy Chief of Staff, to the Kwantung Army to bring the situation under control. However, Tsuji, who had planned the Nomonhan operation in the Kwantung Army, believed that there was no chance against the Soviet forces, which had several times the firepower and strength of the Kwantung Army. He planned a massive night raid by 3 divisions. Tsuji is said to have told those around him that this was not a good idea and that there was no other way to win. Nakajima of the General Staff Headquarters, who had come to settle the situation, agreed to Tsuji's large-scale night raid. The General Staff learned of this and gave Nakajima an even firmer order to withdraw from the area, and Nakajima pressed Ueda, the commander of the Kwantung Army, to carry out the order. The General Staff's strong indication of its intention finally caused the Kwantung Army headquarters to relent, and all offensive operations in Nomonhan were halted, effectively ending the Nomonhan incident on September 6. Peace negotiations between Ambassador Togo and Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov began on September 14. The Soviets were preparing to invade Poland, which was a secret agreement with Germany, and were thinking of concluding peace negotiations in the short term at any cost. Togo was concerned that failure to negotiate peace would likely lead to all-out war with the Soviets, but he also had concerns about whether the Kwantung Army would honor its commitments if negotiations were concluded on unfavorable terms. Togo persistently negotiated and proposed a compromise plan to define the border at the point currently occupied. Foreign Minister Molotov agreed, complaining about why we, who are winning the war, should make concessions, but aiming for peace at an early date. 2 days after reaching a ceasefire agreement on September 15, the Soviets invaded Poland. Togo regretted that if he had persisted in negotiations for 2 more days, he would have been able to conclude more favorable ceasefire terms. After the ceasefire, the General Staff held the Kwantung Army headquarters responsible. Tsuji, the lone General Staff member who had practically led the war and was considered the real commander of the Kwantung Army, was only transferred to a different department. This was because many influential people in the army held Tsuji in high esteem. High-ranking army officials did not charge Kometsubara, commander of the 23rd Division, with any crime, saying that generals who fought on the front lines were blameless. However, Kometsubara, the division commander, was transferred to the reserves as a form of taking responsibility. The problem was the soldiers who left the battlefield and withdrew on their own. Aoki and Haste, who commanded the defensive positions, were commanders who fought extremely well in the face of overwhelming odds, with little ammunition and food. However, the Japanese military had never experienced defeat since the Meiji period and had never withdrawn from a battlefield without permission. Kometsubara, who resigned his post to take responsibility, never forgave them for abandoning the field without permission. This was due in no small part to the influence of Higashi, who also ran out of ammunition and was surrounded but never left the scene and was wiped out. Kometsubara believed that if they were not ordered to leave, they should die like Higashi. Kometsubara wanted to court-martial them, but the top brass would not allow him to court-martial Aoki and Haste, who had fought bravely. Kometsubara urged them to commit suicide, as punishment of subordinate commanders was under the authority of military commanders and division commanders. Both Aoki and Haste did not resist this measure in any way, and silently committed suicide. The army assessed the Soviets' capabilities as something to be reckoned with. Until then, the army had considered the Soviets as a virtual enemy and did not consider the United States, which it regarded as a virtual enemy of the Navy, as a fighting partner. The Nomonhan incident led Japan to lean toward a theory of southward expansion, aiming for Southeast Asia in the south rather than advancing north. 1941 saw the Soviets and Germans enter into all-out war. Foreign Minister Matsuoka, who had concluded a military alliance with Germany, enthusiastically called for Japan to enter the Soviet Union, but the army was cautious about starting a war with the Soviets. The Soviets had been vigilant against Japan since the Nomonhan incident, and even after the war with Germany began, they deployed 1.56 million soldiers and a large number of armored units in the Far East until the end of the war. This is equivalent to 30% of the Red Army's strength, which shows just how wary the Soviets were of Japan. Zhukov put 400,000 soldiers, including those who had experienced Nomonhan, into the war against Germany and crushed the German Central Army Group. The Nomonhan gave Zhukov great war experience, and he would become a Soviet hero in the war against Germany. Nomonhan was an important battle, often referred to as the First Battle of World War II. However, the Japanese military was unable to apply the painful lessons learned from this battle, and the war moved on to the Pacific War. In the next article, I will explain the history of the Navy. If you enjoyed this article, please subscribe to our channel and click the like button.